I bid you a very good morning, a very good afternoon, a very good evening, depending on where the world you are in. And I welcome you to Phoenix Rising, 10 predictions for 2017. My name is Dan Sommer, and I'm a senior director here at Qlik. I head up our market intelligence unit, and I've been with Qlik for about almost 2 years now. And I've been given the great privilege and honor to talk about what we see when we bring out the crystal ball for 2017 in terms of predictions and how that is affecting us beyond that as well. So I thought it would be very appropriate for us to essentially start by talking about the megatrends, talking about the macro factors that I think are the underlying root cause for much of what we're experiencing right now. And what we're experiencing is a big bang where everything is getting distributed from that central core and further out into the fringes, which means that we will move from a state of central power to increasingly decentralized empowerment. And they are essentially driven by 4 trends. The first one is the explosion of data and fragmentation of data and content, which I think very few of us would actually dispute that is happening. The second trend that we're experiencing is that we are seeing computing and an explosion, frankly, in computing happening right now, where Moore's law continues, but also the price of computing and processing is coming down, which means that we see increased potential for analytic power further out into the fringes. And of course, as a function of those, we also see the rise of freemium as business models, the sharing economy, and new ecosystems that are forming to cater for that fragmentation. And the final trend is the rise of usage further and further out into the fringe, and clearly the rise of the information activist in organization. The only problem with this picture is that 3 of them, access, data, and computing, are growing exponentially, whereas usage is growing in a more linear fashion. So we are experiencing the rise of the information activist, but unfortunately that isn't growing at the same pace as the other trends, which means that there is a gap that is forming. And unfortunately, activism in organizations will not be enough, because there is so much data coming out of that exhaust. We're experiencing data pollution, which essentially means that even good data can get polluted with bad data. And even when we have good data, we don't know what is the good data because there are other polluted data sets out there alongside it. So in that fragmentation, it gets increasingly difficult to know, as an example, what is true and what isn't. This is something we've clearly experienced in social media, where we're seeing these click monsters, as we call it, or essentially news spreading so fast like wildfires that they are becoming almost like a truism in organizations, in readership. I give you one example out of my native Sweden, where essentially the Prime Minister of Sweden, there was this news that spread that his watch was a Patek Philippe and worth tens of thousands of dollars. And because it spread so fast in the blogosphere, in social media, it became a truism, even though it absolutely wasn't. And in some cases, these type of truisms can even spread into reputable news outlets. So what do we do when we're handling all of that data pollution? Well, one mechanism is to look at data bias, where algorithms from Facebook, where algorithms from Google is taking all of that data and try to filter it for us so that only the data that we like or that is confirming our biases is coming to us. Well, that poses a problem in itself because it very much creates echo chambers confirming the confirmations that we already have as biases. Another phenomenon that we're seeing is this whole concept of data fatigue, where we simply grow tired of looking at the data. And the famous words from Michael Gove from the Brexit campaign sort of underlines this trend when he said, "We are sick and tired of experts." And that is a significant problem when we are sick and tired of experts and their facts, and we increasingly just go with our gut feel, which could, in worst case scenario, turn into data ignorance. Now, many of us in this pollution, in this explosion of data that's coming out of that exhaust, is wishing back to simpler and easier times when we didn't have to deal with so many data-driven decisions. And I think that is why we're experiencing this phenomena right now, which actually became the word of the year in the Oxford Dictionary, often referred to as the post-truth era. I call it the post-fact era. And you can just go to the US election campaign to see what happened there. We had so-called fact checkers that were looking at the facts that were spouted out during the debates. And it turns out that upwards of, I think it was 79% of the facts spoken about in those debates turned out to be absolutely incorrect. And even the so-called facts like polling institutes were completely incorrect in terms of predicting the outcome of the election. So there's a serious crisis right now where we're simply not trusting the data anymore, and we're increasingly going with our emotions. And frankly, just when we were supposed to be ushered into the digital age with much more facts, we're in this state of crisis where I think it's valid to ask the question, are we worse at making data-driven decisions today than we have been in the past? That is why 2016 was the year of information activism, because this is the new aristocracy in organizations that can help wrangle all of that information and turn it into something that helps us make decisions that help us get to better insights and become more enlightened. The only problem is we can't clone enough of the information activists. So we clearly see that this constituency is growing, and I'm talking about data engineers, data scientists, application developers, web developers, business analysts, those people that make dealing with information their trade. But to really deal with this onslaught of data and the widening gap between the data and our ability to consume it, I'm coining 2017 the year of data literacy, which means that we will need to move more data literacy to a broader constituents and a broader populace, both in organizations and outside. I see that as the only remedy to get us out of the post-fact era that I talked about earlier. Because just like literacy moved from a nice to have to an absolute must-have 100 years ago, as we moved from agricultural areas more into cities, more into a services economy, literacy moved from something that was the domain of scholars to something that had to be the domain of everyone. We need to go through that exact transition and that exact journey when it comes to data literacy as well. Well, luckily, I see Phoenix rising. I see 10 trends that I will be speaking about today that, in confluence with one another, will help Phoenix rise out of the ashes and get unchained from that state of post-fact that we're in right now to a more enlightened state of data literacy. And I'm not saying that we will arrive at data literacy in 2017. I'm saying that 2017 will be the catalyst year when we're starting to get on that steeper part of the S-curve. So let me go through these trends one by one. I think it would be helpful for us to first and foremost really look at the definition of data literacy. And there are multiple definitions of data literacy out there, including the ability to read, work with, analyze, and argue with the data. This definition comes from MIT and Emerson University. Reading data, it involves understanding what data is and what aspects of the world it represents. Working with data involves creating, acquiring, cleaning, and managing it. And analyzing the data, where much of the domain has been historically, is about filtering, sorting, aggregating, comparing, and performing other such analytic operations. And then argue with data, which essentially involves using data to support a larger narrative intended to communicate some message to a particular audience, but also argue with the data in terms of, is the data set I'm looking at accurate? Can I trust this data? Well, the good news is that in 2017, I think that the concept of visualization will move from analysis only to the whole information supply chain. And that essentially means that already at the data level, when you're reading the data, we see improved data semantics. We see more and more data catalogs that help you map out and help you visualize the different and fragmented data sets that you have out there, and help you see what data sets are more trustworthy, what data sets are less trustworthy, etc. So there's a lot of innovation happening in just visualizing out from an information asset management perspective. Then we see more and more visualization coming to the data preparation stage. This is the stage before the visual analysis. This is the work with data, as in the definition there. And this is really a budding industry right now because, frankly, many of those business analysts that have rendered the data previously want to see a deeper lineage straight into the data set and want to wrangle the data themselves. So we'll see more visual approaches to do that yourself. Because the data preparation shouldn't just be about looking at the raw data, but it should be, the analysis should already start there in a fragmented world. And the third one is where visual analysis has traditionally been. Visual analysis. But even in this state, analyze your data. We see significant improvements with more visualizations coming, deeper and more dense data sets that can be visualized, but also easier access to libraries where people innovate and put new types of visualization in those libraries. So this is very much a living organism by itself. And of course, we're also seeing that important final step, or last mile if you want to call it that, to really close that information cycle loop. And that is about arguing with the data. We see more and more innovation in the area of storytelling, in the area of collaborating with data. And if there's something that 2016 has taught us, it is that emotion very often wins over rational thought. So this part, where frankly you can be subjective with the data, but you can go straight into the data set and the analysis and see the lineage of the data, will help in essentially bringing data and emotion together, and rational thought and gut feel together. And I think that is a huge step to close that data literacy gap. And we see huge pent-up demand for this. A BARC survey that just ran essentially shows that upwards of 80% see this as very, very valuable in the organization, but only a fraction of organizations have actually adopted this. And when you close the loop between these four, then you essentially hold the hand of the data from bringing it in, from reading it, all the way to working with, analyzing, and argue with the data. And when you do that, you get much more trust in that whole information supply chain. And that's really going to help. So the concept of visualization will move from just analysis only, that bottom circle, to that whole chain of data literacy in 2017. The second trend that we're experiencing and seeing for 2017 is some triggering factors in terms of really improved semantics and how that will shift the big data discussion from one of volume to one more of variety or one of combinations. Because let's be honest with each other. If we go back the last 5-10 years as this big data hype has peaked and even gone through the peak of expected inflated expectations and down to the trough, we can essentially close the books and say that the first wave of big data hasn't been as successful as we would have thought. And that very much of that has to do that we're hoarding data with no clear purpose. And that has frankly proved inefficient in most cases. Just throwing data into a lake isn't necessarily useful. And Gartner validates this by saying that through 2018, 90% of deployed data lakes will be useless as they're overwhelmed with information assets captured for uncertain use cases. Well, I go back to my Gartner days, and we had something there called the art of the possible, where many of my colleagues were collecting successful references from different industries where big data analytics have had an impact. And what was striking was that in most of the cases, these innovative use cases weren't about the volume of the data, but much more about interesting, innovative combinations. Now, why do we say that this will happen in 2017? Well, the compelling event is that more and more of the data that we're looking at is external, is cloud-based. And those data sets are easier to do data models on, and because they very often, sort of over a longer period of time, look similar. So if you're bringing in a Twitter data set, for example, you kind of can decipher the structure of that data, and you do that work once to sort of combine the data models of the external data with your internal data, and you can reuse that multiple times. So as more of the data becomes software as a service oriented or external, it becomes easier to sort of build the semantics for those and reuse them multiple times and combine with internal data. So that's one trend, and clearly mechanisms such as different types of catalogs and mechanisms that offer internal and external data will help along that journey where people have done that work for you, so that combining data sets become easier. Now, what will that unlock for us? Well, it will help Phoenix rise out of the ashes because big data analytics becomes much more agile all of a sudden. So it can become much more solution-oriented and really raising that art of the possible, providing much better data quality as well. Right, that moves us on to the third trend, and I've already kind of touched upon it in the previous slide, and it is that in 2017 we'll most likely experience some sort of tipping point for the cloud, where more than half of organizations are either starting to use it or planning to adopt it. And as that happens, I think we'll see more and more cloud acceptance, which can tip acceptance over for the cloud to a larger extent. Now, the data I'm using here is from Gartner, but also other data such as BARC numbers that I've seen when it comes to adoption confirm that this is in the right ballpark. And if that is correct, then we'll see potentially that tipping over to more than 50% in 2017. But it's very important to understand that that adoption is unevenly distributed. So clearly, you have your little startup in the Silicon Valley that is much more ahead when it comes to cloud adoption because they don't necessarily have any technical debt or any infrastructure, whereas other, especially enterprise-wide organizations that have built third normalized form and sort of curated their systems of record infrastructure over a period of decades that they now run their business on are much more hesitant and skeptic to move over all of their data to the cloud. And that's why we're also seeing that the data warehousing aspects, as you can see there, are trailing behind somewhat from the on-premises BI deployments. And this is very often what is referred to as data gravity. We also see some significant variances from a geographic perspective. So I recently toured Europe and did 8 Visualize Your World keynotes, which is our big sort of roadshow event that we're doing. And I always made sure to poll the audience when I was speaking and ask how many hands essentially went up when I asked what proportion of you are currently running your BI and analytics in the cloud. And there were clearly big variances. And I would say especially in sort of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, countries like Germany and Poland are much more conservative for varying reasons. It could be privacy concerns, it could be regulations, and other things that make that adoption to the cloud much slower than in some other parts of the world. Now, what does this unlock for us then? Well, increased cloud acceptance will remove many of those startup costs to just get an instance started and provide scale and get going with analytics without having to necessarily buy all of that infrastructure. Right. The next trend for 2017 is that we see a shift from advanced analytics to advancing analytics. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So, data scientists are clearly a very treasured and prized asset. Unfortunately, they don't grow on trees, and we haven't learned how to clone them yet. And they are extremely valuable when they build the statistical models, when they get those algorithms that we can do predictive models on. But frankly, those algorithms, those models should probably be governed by those data scientists. They should be curated by those data scientists because governance of analytical models is perhaps equally or even more important than governance of data. But it is a good idea to bring in those curated and governed models that are built in, let's say, statistical workbenches, etc., into self-services tools so that the broader populace, more people, information activists and data literate people can leverage those models. The other aspect that we see advancing analytics is machine learning. Now, this is clearly a big area right now. You could argue that artificial intelligence with deep learning, with machine learning, with neural networks is the new big data when it comes to hype. It's certainly something that we see a lot of activity around. Research firm CB Insights essentially report that 140 AI startups started up in 2016 compared to 70 in all of 2011. So clearly an area where there's a lot of innovation and a lot of startup activity going on right now. And we can leverage much smarts that come out of machine learning, or what you can more broadly call artificial intelligence, or what people refer to as artificial intelligence, by bringing, again, that into the self-services tools, which will essentially help from a time to insight perspective if you have things like recommendations and helping you around the data preparation phase, but also finding patterns and sharing findings. But it should not be a black box. I go back to that definition of data literacy that we spoke about earlier, and really holding the hand of the data from its inception and bringing it in to all the way that you tell a story about it is extremely important for that trust. So we want to see that data lineage, and we want to doubt that data. we want to question it, and we want to bring human reasoning in. As many human heads as possible that can explore in that data and frankly provide that non-linear thinking, that synthesis that humans are so good at doing, and that asking those strategic questions in particular where humans still excel, let's say, over algorithms and machines. So if we bring all of those components in, we see that sweet spot in the middle, and that is essentially what's going to bring advanced analysis to advancing analysis for the broader populace, for more data literate people. And if that happens, then time to insight will be facilitated by bringing in predictive models as well as smarts around data preparation, finding patterns, and sharing findings. And I think it's very important to understand here that this is about augmented intelligence. It's not about artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence trumps artificial intelligence because it brings the human component in as well. It's the famous story from Kevin Kelly, who essentially said that who's the best chess player? Is it the machine, i.e. Deep Blue, or is it Kasparov? No, it's neither. It's both of them in combination. And that is the sweet spot for advancing analytics. Okay, the next trend is, I think Pokemon Go has really been almost like a catalyst or a triggering factor for the digital and physical worlds to come together and become mainstream. It's the next step change in analytics after mobility. And right now, a lot of organizations, a lot of innovation labs are looking at that use case and how it could spread and become so popular and try to replicate that to get even closer to their customer. Just to give you one example, I really do think that the automotive industry has risen to the occasion when it comes to bringing together the digital and the physical worlds. And I'm thinking of companies like Ford, Jaguar, Volvo, and BMW that are essentially taking the concept of not just your dashboard, but increasingly also your windscreen, that huge piece of real estate that you have in front of you when you're driving. And we're seeing already experimentation where that windscreen can become that immersive experience where the digital and physical worlds meet. Because there's no reason why that shouldn't be able to tell you if there's a lot of traffic or if your meeting is delayed, that you should take a different route or start earlier, or that there's a sale going on in the store that you're just passing on your left, etc., etc. So we're seeing a lot of experimentation there, which is quite impressive. I think we'll see more innovation where the digital and physical worlds will begin to meet in analytics. Now, what's the future for this? Well, let's just put it this way. 4 out of 5 teenagers sleep with their cell phones. So I don't really want to think about what that means when the digital and physical worlds come together in analytics, but I'll just put that out there. So the next trend is really about that fourth circle that I showed you right in the beginning when we talked about how everything is becoming a big bang and getting more fragmented. And it is about that accessibility. And I think that in 2017, we'll see self-service visualization becoming a commodity, accessible for all. And when I say that, I mean desktop-based self-service visualization. There is no reason why that should have a huge price tag on it. And frankly, we're seeing that changing right now. To explain that, let's take a trip down memory lane and go back to how software used to be sold. Well, it used to be sold into corporate IT that had to rubber stamp a massive project, and it was what we call like enterprise license agreements, where then corporate IT in a one-to-many type of fashion used to push out the reports and the visualizations. Well, then we saw, especially with the emergence of in-memory and self-contained architectures that could more easily be deployed in a more agile fashion, that departmental heads and departmental units and business units and shadow IT could start building their own analytical stacks. And as that happened, we moved further out into the fringes of business units. Then what we could call lands started happening, where information activists could, in a very or a reasonably easy way, sort of bring their own analytical stacks in, where they paid a couple of $1,000 and then they had access to an analytical tool that they could then, in a many to few type of approach, build applications on that will spread more broadly to the ecosystem around them. But what we've seen now, and what we'll see even more clearly in 2017, is that move to freemium, where essentially data discovery tools or self-service visualization tools from a desktop perspective are essentially free to get started with. And that's essentially going to help more people get started. It's going to remove the barriers of entry so that more people can do personal analytics and over time probably move into more enlightened information activists. There is absolutely no rationale for why a desktop-based visualization tool should cost several $1,000s in today's environment, where there are so many tools that can provide a really good experience that more people can start using. And the big prize here is when you scale it out, when you start sharing, when you get people into your ecosystem. And that is essentially what is the root cause of what I call moving into the personal analytics era. But personal analytics can be about two things. It can be about how you leverage analytics for your own self-serving purposes and not just to provide some data point to your boss. So we see the emergence of that, but it could also mean that analytics become much more about the person, because you will have many more approaches to be able to have segment of one and really target individuals from a marketing and sales perspective down to the individual level. Both of these are much more enabled through providing freemium opportunities. And really that change in business models is also really affecting how we're procuring analytics. And therefore, it becomes much more of an outside-in type of approach to procuring analytics rather than an inside-out approach. And that is essentially changing how the market ticks and how the market reacts and where the battlefields are. Because we can, in a similar vein, sort of build out how the market has evolved, where we've had the red and blue stacks that were sold into that IT department, and then we got those more agile analytical tools from a departmental perspective, and then the tools for the information activists, and further out to the broader populace, where they, in an easier way, can start procuring analytics for themselves. That is the new normal. So the 2016 Magic Quadrant for Gartner is essentially driving home that point when they spoke about data discovery all of a sudden becoming modern BI, and how modern BI needs to be user-driven, it needs to be business-driven, but it will also need to scale. So it's not enough to just provide agility for those data literates and information activists, but it needs to scale more broadly and become more enterprise class. And that's essentially what's gonna separate the boys from the men, if we call it that. Because as modern BI is increasingly overtaking traditional BI to become the new reference architecture, then we will see what tools are better at being able to govern your data, what tools are better at bringing together multiple data sources, and what tools can really bring in a platform type of approach to self-service. And as that happens, that trade-off doesn't necessarily need to happen anymore between agility and governance, or between flexibility or scale. But we will have these elastic open platforms that can be for the few in the business unit or for that individual, but can also scale up to become an enterprise class deployment. And now 2017 will essentially be about moving that to the next step, not just to sit alongside traditional BI, but increasingly overtaking traditional BI and also replacing traditional BI to a large extent. So it becomes a new reference architecture. And when that happens, much as a victim of its own success, self-service and discovery will be much more scalable enterprise-wide, and more people can get started on that self-service journey. So we've spoken a lot about traditional BI and how that only reached really to the chosen few and perhaps the managerial levels in organizations, and how modern BI tapped the information activist in particular, and increasingly is tapping also the data literate individuals that want to get started with it. But I think if we really want to reach, quote unquote, that other half, if we call it that, those less skilled information workers that don't necessarily know how to be a producer and a consumer of applications, then we need to customize applications much more to build really contextualized, customized analytical applications that people can consume in the context of what they want to look at. So that's really going to help by being able to provide a rich exploratory paradigm, for example, in intranets, in extranets, and increasingly also being embedded into the workflow of where people live their daily lives, whether that's applications or whether that's some other process that you're involved in, to capture not just the information workers, but increasingly also operational workers or workers with information on the go. And through doing that, we need to go through a transition where analytics is a destination that you go to do analysis. And that will continue to be important, but to capture, quote unquote, the other half, we increasingly need to also make analytics come to you. So you get hundreds, if not thousands of touch points every day where some analytic is hitting you. So that's how I see that 2017 will increasingly shift to focus more and more on custom analytical applications, data-driven applications, but also analytics in the application. And if we go through all of those steps, and 2017 will clearly be a triggering step for many of them, then we will have many more people being enlightened by self-service, being data-driven, being an analytical node, if we call it that. And that is the way that you maximize the potential for innovation, but also insights in your organization. But analytical nodes disconnected from one another isn't really that useful, because we know that we really want to collaborate when we're working together. So therefore, I think 2017 will really be that year when ecosystems will need to prove their strength, because ecosystems are what can handle that increased distribution that we're experiencing in organizations. And that distribution will be about data, where ecosystems of data are forming, combining fragmented and multiple data sources, and portals that can map out what data can be trusted and can't be trusted, but also about taking that data and bringing it to more people and ecosystems and connections and networks of people, where more people are literate and they can graduate to become activists and specialists and capture their ideas to a large extent, so that ideas can be reused, can be collaborated upon, and provide that wisdom of the crowds, because frankly none of us is as smart as all of us. And through capturing those ideas in these many analytic centers of excellence in organizations, we will be able to much better leverage the full wisdom of the organization. So therefore, 2017 will really be the year when ecosystems will increasingly prove their strength, and will move from nodes increasingly to networks. And by facilitating all of those things, 2017 will be the year of hybrid cloud and multi-environment, because frankly, that is the way we're increasingly going to be working. It's not going to be something binary where we're looking at internal and external data, or internal or external data, but it's going to be about those in combination with one another. It's going to be about the combination of computing in many different places, on-premise, in public clouds, in private clouds, and out in the edge. And it's going to be about our consumption being very different and right size for different parts, bringing more data literate people in. Whether that is about central publishing, or about embedding it into the business process, or about information activists and perhaps even data literates increasingly creating their own applications. And it's about not making any compromises anymore between open, elastic platforms and security, governance, and trust on the back end. So then we'll make that journey to much more open platforms and ecosystems that I spoke about earlier. So those were my 10 trends. As you can see, all of them will unlock something, will be the root cause of how Phoenix will be able to finally rise out of the ashes from that state of post-fact that we've been in, and which is very inhibitive for us to move into the digital age, to one where we can move more into a data literate age going forward and become much more fact-driven. So let me repeat what those 10 trends are. The first one is about really visualizing that whole information supply chain. Taking all of those components of what constitute data literacy, the ability to read, the ability to work with, the ability to analyze, and the ability to argue with the data. That whole chain will become much more visually driven in 2017. We see a shift from big data increasingly to big insights, and that second wave of big data analytics is going to focus much more about facilitating data combinations, because data combinations eat big data for breakfast. We'll see a move from on-premises as being the dominating architecture, if we call it that, to one where cloud is reaching a tipping point, and where a majority of organizations will either plan in the near term or have already adopted cloud. Not in a wall-to-wall fashion, but somewhere in their organization. But it will be unevenly distributed. We'll see a move from increasingly advanced analytics to advancing analytics. And it will be helped by bringing in predictive models and bringing in things like machine learning and smarts into the self-service experience and into the exploratory experience, where more humans can benefit from that. Okay, data scientists are humans too. And a move from the physical and the digital worlds essentially clashing with each other. And Pokemon Go really is the catalyst for what is possible here, and more and more industries will look at how the physical and digital worlds will meet, which is the next step change after mobility. Things like IoT and geospatial and augmented reality are all technologies that will facilitate that. We'll see that desktop-based visualization will increasingly be available for everyone with no massive price tag slapped on top of it. And that's really going to help more people getting started on that journey. And we'll see modern BI, much a victim of its own success, from the outside in, increasingly scaling in organizations and becoming the new reference architecture. We'll see a move from analytics as a place you go to increasingly analytics coming to you and hitting you hundreds, thousands of times every day in your moments. And that will be helped by data-driven custom analytic applications that could be built quickly and be contextualized and analytics in the application. And then we'll see a shift from increasingly analytical nodes, nodes of data, nodes of people, nodes of ideas increasingly becoming networked with one another. And therefore, 2017 will be the year when ecosystems, communities, partners, etc. will be able to show their muscle. And then we'll see a move from a binary state where it's an either or to one where it's an and, where you can have internal and external data, where you can have compute in multiple different places, where you can have the consumption and the analysis in multiple different places, right sides for different parts of the organization. And frankly, that is the dominating architecture that will become more preeminent in 2017. So with that, I'd like to thank you. I think we just about have a little bit of time for some questions as well, and there are plenty of questions coming into the feed here. The first one is about data storing and whether it's difficult, or if we're seeing anyone actually adopting that, or if it's just a hyped term. Well, what I can say here is that we've spoken about right sizing on multiple occasions here. I think it's very important to demystify data storytelling, because I think there's a whole nascent, budding sort of job title, which is data artisans, data journalists, storytellers, etc., that do this as a profession. So if you can bring those into your organization, they can do really advanced things, perhaps build their own visualizations on top of an open platform that can perhaps show, let's say, the logistical flow in a hospital or something like that. Things that don't come out of the box and really tell a compelling story. Now, that's one part of storytelling, but I don't think that storytelling ends there. I think storytelling can also be just about that iterative flow, which will help that cycle that we spoke about earlier around data literacy come alive. So if you have a really close and tight iterative flow between storytelling, the data preparation, and visual analysis, then you can make so many different data sets come alive to a much larger extent. And you can do that immediately in your analytical applications and then go straight into storytelling mode. So I think the tighter linkage between those will demystify much of the data literacy. Right, so let me see. Do I see any longer term trends, perhaps contrarian thinking? Well, when I'm speaking about 2017 trends, I can't really go too conceptual and too out there. But a few things that I'm sort of dabbling with more conceptually is what will happen in a world where we have fewer screens? So that's one interesting aspect. What will happen to visualization in those type of scenarios and those type of worlds? Well, I think visualization will increasingly need to become not a purpose by itself, but rather something that helps you facilitate you in the context that you are in. So if you have really fast data crawling, data combination facilities around you, you can just say, you can ask a question of your data, and perhaps an answer comes to you, but then you can clap your hand and say, show me, and it will essentially visualize things around that data point that you've already arrived at. So I think visualization will increasingly be something that provides context around your answer, and that can be built in a more iterative way. I also think another interesting sort of thought experiment is, what would make data start to decline? Clearly we're seeing more and more data being transient and actually never being stored, especially when it comes to IoT becoming more dominant and real-time analytics and prescriptive and predictive analytics, where the algorithms make decisions in an instant. Well, it's interesting to think if we're going to, like really far out in the future, reach some sort of a plateau where data will actually maybe plateau and even start shrinking. I haven't arrived at an answer for that one, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment. Any more questions here? What is Qlik doing around promoting data literacy? Right, so apart from trying to provide world-class tools that make more people more empowered in organizations and connect data, people, and ideas, which is our vision, we also have several initiatives in place. For example, academic programs at many different schools where we can help professors build courses and get free access to a whole bunch of different collateral free of charge. So if you're in academia, don't hesitate to contact us about that. We also have an online learning portal which we call Click Continuous Classroom, and that can add essentially all kinds of courses, and many of them are completely free of charge, where we have modules in particular around the area of improving data literacy. So things like correlation versus causation, what are false positives and false negatives, and A and B testing, etc. So anyone can, for free, leverage that resource that we have as well. So with that, I am thanking you very much for your patience, for listening to me on our State of the Union for this year in terms of what trends we're experiencing out there. With that, thank you very much.